You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 293 of Meet the Farmers. I'm your host, Ben Eagle. Today, we're exploring the question, what happens when women take the lead in transforming our food systems to fight climate change? And, of course, in the context of regenerative agriculture. My guest is the author and social justice journalist, writer, Stephanie Anderson. Who has spent a lot of time exploring the intersection of regenerative agriculture, sustainability, and equity. She's the author of the award-winning One Size Fits None, a farm girl's search for the promise of regenerative agriculture, and she lives in South Florida, where she is assistant professor of creative nonfiction at Florida Atlantic University. Her latest book, From the Ground Up, The Women Revolutionizing Regenerative Agriculture, sheds light on some of the women reshaping farming practices, challenging the status quo, and driving change. So we're going to be talking about storytelling today. We're going to be talking about research, but we'll also be talking about the triumphs, struggles, and innovations of women at the forefront of the regenerative agriculture movement. Stephanie, welcome to Meet the Farmers.
Oh, thank you for having me. It is so fun to be here.
Great to have you. Can you start by telling us about your background and what led you to focus in this particular case in your latest book with regenerative ag?
So I grew up in South Dakota. It's a state kind of in the middle of the United States. It's a prairie environment, really suitable for raising cattle. There's a lot of large ranches out there. So I grew up on my family's ranch, and that was a really formative experience, as I'm sure you can imagine.
Oh, yes.
I did all kinds of ranch work, rode horses, branded cattle, and swapped hay, put up fence, all those types of things. And long story short, I went into agricultural journalism for a little bit. It was a pretty brief stint. I reported there in South Dakota after college. And then I went to Florida to get my master's degree in creative nonfiction. And I just couldn't stop thinking about agriculture because during that time that I was doing that reporting, I was noticing that, things were starting to get a little bit strange in our agricultural system here in the States. A lot of big agriculture, a lot of heavy chemical use, a lot of GMOs, a lot of big industrial operations. So I thought, is there a better way? And so that's how I came to write One Size Fits None when I was doing my master's degree, because you had to basically write the equivalent of a book. So that's kind of the way in. And yeah, I just have always been interested in that, even though I haven't been living in farm country for a while.
Okay. And tell us about the new book. It's called From the Ground Up. It's about a number of different women in the regenerative agriculture movement. What was your why for this?
Yeah, so the why came out of the pandemic because like so many people in the US and of course around the world, supply chains just went awry, right, during the pandemic. And here we face some pretty serious issues with getting our farm products to market. Like our farmers were having to plow under crops because they couldn't get them to market in time. Our dairy farmers were having to dump milk because, again, the supply chain couldn't get to them. And meanwhile, our consumers, we were not able to get food on the other end. And I thought, is this going to keep happening the next time we have some sort of disaster, whether it's climate or another pandemic, anything that we don't know about? Is this going to keep happening to our food system? So I wanted to find out who was starting to work on this. And the more I dove into the food system during and after, that those early days of the pandemic, the more I saw that it was women that were starting to piece this together, and they had been working on these issues for quite some time. So that's kind of where the second book came from, and I wanted to look at more parts of the food system than farming alone. So like I do obviously profile several farmers in the book, but it's also looking at women up and down the food chain, like from distribution to policy to research to local community organizing, all types of things like that.
Are there any particular stories that really stood out to you when you were going through this research?
Yeah. I feel all the stories are interesting because I am just so impressed by the women that are in the book and like the work that they're doing. But that stuck out to me a lot was the story of Kelsey Scott. She it was a rancher in South Dakota. When I've interviewed her, she was just 27 years old. She already had a master's degree in like range science. And she just was bringing all this indigenous wisdom to her work and bringing in, really ancient ways of thinking and land stewardship that her indigenous ancestors had used on the land for thousands of years, and using that to inform her management style and bringing a brand new regenerative approach to their cattle ranch. And so I found that particularly interesting, not only because of that native perspective and the many ways that she was implementing that, but also because she was doing it in an environment that was very similar to where I grew up. It was only a few hours drive away. So it was like just really cool to see what was possible in that landscape.
Now, you've already said that you started as an ag journalist, and clearly storytelling is very central to what you do. So, if we look at ag storytelling in general, I mean, you and I both know that there are heaps of incredible personal stories out there, but also the broad stories that we engage with as storytellers within this niche. But what is the power of storytelling for you within agriculture, and why is it so important?
That is an excellent question, and I'm really glad you asked it because we have a situation now where so many people do not know where their food comes from. They don't know a farmer or rancher. They're very separated from, things like soil and ecology and just, livestock and all the work that goes into and care that goes into producing food. So I look at storytelling as a way to bridge that gap, as a way to bring, sort of the everyday consumer and, our many farmers and ranchers together and to try to create some common ground and to try to help each side understand each other. Because sometimes here in the States, at least, we have kind of a perceived urban rural divide. And that can get really harmful when it comes to how consumers view farmers and vice versa. And we don't want to see each other as the enemy. So I think that stories are a great gateway for building, sort of community and consensus, and also just helping people see themselves in the work, right? Like, we don't offer here in the States agriculture as a viable career for young people. We just feel like, oh, you'd leave the farm. No smart kid would stay and farm. But I think if we can show young people stories of successful farming, regenerative, it's exciting. It's not this sort of industrial tough life that I think they're used to seeing. I think that can also be another huge benefit of storytelling.
What have you learnt about the role of women in the regenerative agriculture movement?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I'll preface it by saying that, it's not like men are not involved in the movement, and so many are, and they're doing such a great job, and they're partnering with women and people from all types of backgrounds, right? It just is in our storytelling, men have tended to get prioritized, in the different books, films, and the sort of experts that get interviewed. So, what I've learned about the role of women is that often they're doing this work, but it goes unseen sometimes. And also, they're bringing this really neat holistic perspective that we know from the data that women leaders tend to have when they approach leadership and working with others. They go through the lens of collaboration and partnerships and sort of like holistic thinking, or how are my decisions impacting not just me but also the next generation. So that's the really unique thing that women are bringing to the food system. And that means that that they're trying to build a food system that's going to be good for people far in the future, whether that's soil management or health, nutrition, and equity, right? Regenerative is part of rebuilding our rural communities and helping our rural communities thrive. So they're able to look at agriculture from all those different perspectives and make decisions around that.
Yeah, I think that sense of equity is really key as well, isn't it? Because actually, regen itself, and we're certainly seeing this in the UK, but you see it in the States and elsewhere as well, that regenerative isn't just about, it's not just about soil, actually. It's about a whole different way of looking at farming, but looking at food and looking at life as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's why regenerative is so exciting because it can help make our rural communities whole again and our rural families whole again. I mean, our farmers have been struggling for so many years under, sort of decreasing prices, increasing input costs. And that has driven people out of farming. And then that by extension, that pushes people out of communities. And we don't have people that run the businesses that, support that rural population too. So absolutely. So it's about economic, equity, but also like social and environmental justice too, as well. Like regenerative is bringing more people into the fold versus pushing out. So I find that really exciting.
With the women who you interviewed for this particular book, but perhaps in your wider work as well, what are you discovering in terms of challenges and barriers, things that they're raising with you, that are perhaps holding them back at all?
Oh, yeah, there's still a lot because there's, as much as these women and others like them are doing amazing work and making a lot of progress, there are barriers. So one is getting access to financing and, sort of the capital that they need to operate their farms or scale up or to transition an industrial operation to a regenerative one. Here in the United States, our agricultural loans are often geared toward industrial production at a large scale. And there's a lot of skepticism in the institutions about regenerative. So those loans are not as easily available. That capital is not as easily accessible to them because of what they're doing. And sometimes they're doing it at a smaller scale or different time horizons than investors really want to work with. So that's a big barrier. But we can overcome that if we put our minds to it, I think. Another is just sort of the perceived inability of regenerative to feed the world, and that's such a difficult concept to break down because we have seen study after study show that regenerative is highly productive and and can definitely feed our population. And that industrial production, on the other hand, is not doing a good job at those things. But still that mindset lingers. So I think overcoming that is going to be key.
Yeah, but also that's key when storytelling comes in as well, isn't it? Going back to that, so that actually it's the way that's all about framing and the way that you
Mhm.
frame two different systems.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, the story of industrial is one that has been, sort of tightly controlled by big ag and, big food and has been framed as this wonderful, miraculous way of producing food that is, good for farmer, consumer and the land. And that is just, empirically false. But yet that narrative persists. So we also, and when we think about regenerative and sustainable and regenerative organic, how can we make our story, which is real, just as resonant and more powerful to kind of overcome that other narrative? Yeah, you're absolutely right. Storytelling is super key.
When it comes to sort of the broader social justice movement in the States, is there much of a crossover with the regenerative agriculture movement? Where does the regenerative agriculture sort of sit within movements generally? Does it sit in its own silo, or is it actually connected with those sort of wider movements?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of connection and overlap between regenerative and movements for social justice here in the States because regenerative is about sort of that holistic mindset again, and so you can't have like a good healthy community while also having things like systemic racism and discrimination and economic inequality and all the sort of disparities that persist in our culture. So absolutely, and acknowledging and embracing diversity and sort of bringing in, like I mentioned, the indigenous producers' views, right? Like bringing in all that kind of knowledge and allow and acknowledging that regenerative really is a type of food production that has been pioneered way before what we call the sort of Euro-American industrial model, right? These are models that are ancient and that wisdom and all those practices, acknowledging where they actually come from is important and part of that movement too. So that's also gaining, touches on social justice as well. And I mean, I just think, food justice is and environmental justice and social justice are all kind of one and the same. When we have healthy environments and healthy people living in them, that's justice for everyone involved. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of overlap, which I think can help bring more people into the system, even if you're not a farmer or not, directly involved in food production, being involved and active in some of those other movements and can help move regenerative forward.
without delving too much into all the politics that has been happening on your side of the pond the last few months, I'm just interested within the Regen Ag movement. Obviously, a lot of Regen Ag prides itself in sitting aside from the politics and the policies and policy programs. But in terms of that side of things, in terms of policies, programs that you've come across, what is the situation in terms of that sort of support for regenerative practices in the States?
Unfortunately, the situation is pretty dire, as I'm sure you can imagine. I mean, the regenerative funding, and programs for, scaling up and helping farmers transition or helping new farmers access land, climate, programs and studies, research, all these things have been chopped or on the chopping block very soon. I don't think that there's going to be much meaningful support for regenerative within the next few years. I hope that our political system can quickly reverse this damage that's been done and is going to continue for the next couple of years, unfortunately. But in that time, I think regenerative is going to have to go back to its roots and be like, all right, we're operating on our own, and look more to private funding and look more to, kind of impact investors, things like that, that are going to have to fill the gap. Um, because yeah, it's extremely frustrating because, you know, in the prior 4 years, there was a really nice and robust support for things like regenerative, and then just the broader ecosystem of looking at climate change and, other ecological and environmental programming that would support regenerative. So yeah, it's unfortunate, and it's not a good outcome. So
Yeah, but
let's be
from what you're
frank about
saying,
it.
and certainly, yeah, and certainly this is what we're seeing more broadly. I think actually, if you look at Regen Ag on a more global basis, there is this push towards commercial support, towards supply chain support,
Mm-hmm.
because actually, ultimately, consumers are starting to take notice as well, and even the use of the word regenerative is becoming more common, I suppose.
Yeah, it is. We're starting to see some certifications over here. Regenerative or regenerative certified and regenerative organic certified. There's a couple out there. So that's starting to appear on packaging. Yeah, absolutely. It is becoming more of a mainstream word. So that's really great. And, I think I hope that consumers can continue to push for that, because a lot of our big brands here in the US have, well, I mean, they're global brands too, but have they started investing in regenerative, and they're not going to just flip that switch off. And they understand too that, climate change is happening. It's threatening their supply chain. So they may, and I hope they will continue to invest in regenerative independent of what's happening politically. Like, for example, a year or so ago, well, it was more than that now, we had a sriracha shortage here in the United States.
Okay.
You couldn't get sriracha sauce. Well, why? Because the company in California that produced this, there was a massive drought where all of those peppers were grown. They were growing them in Mexico. And it was a climate exacerbated drought. And so, that's just one example of and they had to switch their supply chain. They had to go find a different producer. And so as this kind of threats keeps happening to brands like, oh, I can't source my things, I want to be able to source them reliably. Regenerative production is a better guarantee of being able to have that supply. So I'm just hoping the realities of that can continue to be apparent to, within the food chain.
You mentioned early on in the interview the pandemic, COVID-19,
Mm.
and that, of course, had a massive impact on the way that we perceived, I suppose, the food system at the time. There were some real threats to supply chains and to the way that we procure our food. For you, I'm really interested in your view on this in terms of what do you think the COVID-19 pandemic did in terms of our perception of the food system? And did we see any real shift in the way the food system worked?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, early on, we of course did see like a pretty strong reaction among consumers, and we could see that in the data where consumers were supporting farmers markets, they were buying more organic, they were, and buying locally, things like that. Some of that had to do with that was what was available, that they were finding that they couldn't find what they couldn't access what they need at some of the larger retail chains, so they were turning to their local markets. So that's good. We see some of that is still lingering. We have seen a bit of a drop off here, but there is still a strong support for organic. Organic grows pretty much year over year here. But I think when you talk about perception, I think it shocked people into realizing that they just had no idea who their local farmers were and that they had really handed big food and big ag control over what was going into their homes when it comes to food. And realized like, hey, I need for my own security, I need to be able to look around my area and be able to get more of what I need around here. And so, feeling that fear, I think was a healthy thing for consumers because brings greater appreciation for what farmers are doing, especially in their own backyard.
I mean, this side of the Atlantic, we've definitely got a lot of pressure on cost of living, and there's also
Mhm.
your side as well. There's talks of recession as well, but
Mhm.
perhaps around the corner. So, in that context, when household budgets are squeezed, what does that mean in terms of food? Because is there a danger that things then go the other way?
Oh, yeah, I know, right? I mean, look, I sympathize with consumers who are just trying to find the best deal right now. And oftentimes, the best deal is that industrially produced, kind of lesser quality when it comes to nutrition and how it's grown. So I totally understand that. But I do think we have a little bit of opportunity if we think, I'm trying to see the bright side. Like, for example, with farmers, input costs are going to go up. They already have. So I'm hoping that that will help spur a little more movement into the regenerative space where they can reduce inputs and put more regenerative product into the supply chain at an affordable price for consumers. I mean, two, consumers can avoid things like tariffs and, all that, and maybe sort of these higher price gouging that maybe the big food is trying to implement by turning locally or trying to find other sources. So there are ways for I think consumers to lessen that food cost burden, hopefully by going more locally, where those prices don't always have to increase. But yeah, I know it's a tough balance. We need to pay our farmers fairly, but we also need to be mindful of our consumers and the economic realities that they're facing.
I mean, in that context, what what gives you the most hope um, for for the future of this space within Regen Ag?
For me, it's the young producers because right now here in the US, our average age of a farmer is like 58 years old, a little over. So we're about to have a big land transition change. A lot of our farmers are aging out. And we're seeing a resurgence among young people wanting to get back into farming, and they're excited about doing things differently than their folks did. So they give me hope because, like I mentioned earlier, the young people get it. They are already experiencing climate issues and sort of impacts on their farms, and they want to get resilient. They want to farm differently. So the people I've encountered, like people that appear in the book, for instance, who have transitioned a conventional farm into a regenerative farm. They're able to bring their kids there, their young kids, and, bring more jobs back to their farm per acre than their parents did, than their grandparents. So that's super exciting as we think about the transition ahead and how many people are gearing up to be part of it and hopefully make a change on the land.
I mean, an important question. Where can people buy your book?
Oh yeah. Well, I always say ask your local bookstore to order it
Very
for
good.
you. But obviously there are some other places too online. So you could go to your bigger retailers like your Amazon and so forth. And some of your any local bookstore can order it for you.
And I suppose if listeners go with away from listening to this with one takeaway, what would you like them to remember from this conversation?
I mean, so I would say to look out for regenerative, kind of stay away, watch out, or stay awake rather, in terms of that becoming more out there. When you see something labeled as regenerative or you hear about that more in the conversation, find ways to support it, whether it's buying that product or voting for politicians who support that, or talking to your local farmers about what is regenerative. Is that something that you practice? So just kind of keeping that in their lexicon. I hope that they'll do that.
Hmm. Well, what's coming up for you next? Are you working on a new project at the moment?
I am. I am working on a project that's a bit more personal. It's a little bit less research focused. It's a little
Okay.
more kind of about my time growing up on the farm and what that was like, and so a little more personal.
Well, we will leave it there. Stephanie. But thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us about your work and some of your perspective of what's happening over in the States. Before we go, I
Mhm.
always finish the show with two questions, one of which is a message for the public and one of which is a message for farmers. I wondered if you could give me your messages for them. First of all, the public.
So I'd say message for the public is that, farmers really do care. They want to do a good job. The vast majority of them are not bad actors. They really just want to, stay in business, but they want to, make sure that the farm is there for their next generation too. So, let's in this conversation about regenerative and switching and making sure that we have more environmentally friendly and sustainable models. Let's just make sure we're not vilifying our farmers. Let's all make sure that we talk about what we have in common versus what drives us apart.
And finally, a message to farmers.
Ah, it's similar for farmers. When consumers are asking for something like regenerative or greater accountability and transparency or more sustainable production, that is something that they're doing, not trying to vilify you, but trying to sort of look out for the good of all. So, look at consumers as partners rather than antagonists in the system, and also that there's hope for change, and that going regenerative is totally a possibility. I know that there are a lot of resources out there, so you're not alone in the transition if that's something that you're looking to do.
Well, on that note, that's given some listeners some food for thought. I'm sure we will leave it there. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That is it for today. A big thank you to my guest, Stephanie Anderson, for coming on the show. And don't forget to give her book a search from the ground up, The Women Revolutionizing Regenerative Agriculture. Next time, we will be back closer to home. We'll be in the Cotswolds, just south of the Cotswolds, and I will be joined by former guests of the show from quite a while back. I think they were on 5 or 6 years ago, James and Katie Allen. But for now, I'm Ben Eagle. This has been Meet the Farmers, and thank you very much for listening.